welcome to Critical Junction, episode 52. I'm Mark.
I'm Luke.
And I'm not Jesus.
And the popular death cult known as Christianity centers around the bizarre idea that the God of the Jews incarnated as the character known as Jesus Christ, as depicted in the Bible's New Testament, was executed via crucifixion by Roman soldiers for claiming to be the Messiah, rose from the dead 3 days later, and physically ascended into heaven. According to the story, the entire ordeal was the ultimate sacrifice to save mankind from the original sin committed by Eve in the Old Testament when she ate a magical forbidden fruit, thus condemning all of humanity after her to an existence of pain and suffering. Or in other words, God sacrificed himself to himself in order to appease himself for a rule that he created. But did the character described in the New Testament ever exist? Was there ever a historical figure we today refer to as Jesus Christ? Is the New Testament story purely mythology, or is Jesus some combination of the two? His backstory certainly bears striking similarities to other myths of antiquity. Consider, for example, the story of Dionysus, who, like Jesus, though predating him by at least 1,500 years, was born of a mortal woman, died, and was resurrected. Or, then again, there's the myth of Osiris, who also died and was resurrected. So the myth of a dying and rising God is not unique to Christianity and predates it by centuries. In fact, a large number of the supernatural elements surrounding the Jesus myth can be traced back to earlier deities from various pantheons from antiquity, casting serious doubt about the origins of the story. Even the idea of Jesus' virgin birth appears to have been a later addition to the narrative, which some scholars argue was added almost 200 years after his supposed death and rebirth. The fact is, there were many itinerant Jewish rabbis preaching salvation and supposedly performing miracles around the same time Jesus is said to have lived. And while one of them may have even shared the name, there is insufficient extra-biblical evidence to know to whom the Bible stories are supposed to refer. And even if the character depicted in the Bible were real, there is still no extra-biblical evidence to demonstrate any of the supernatural claims about the character are true, and thus no reason to believe them. It would seem to me that if something so crucial to the religion's core beliefs as the existence of the character upon whom the religion's primary sacrifice depends, then the very foundations of Christianity and everything it stands for are at the very best questionable, and at the worst dogmatic, illusory, or simply not true. So, is the Jesus of the Bible an actual historical figure? Is he simply a myth created by borrowing from and building off of other myths and post hoc attributions of Jewish prophecy, or some combination thereof? Let's talk about that, shall we?
I would think. Yes, I would say that. No, it seems to be a combo of both. It seems that, from what we can tell, there was possibly a Jesus guy, and he upset the Romans and was crucified. But that's about all we really know.
Do we even know that, though? Like I said, there were a lot of people who fit the description who were going about pissing off the Romans.
That's just it. If
everyone was pissing off the Romans,
if there were a real Jesus, that template was applied to with the whole story of the big points of death and rebirth and or death and resurrection and all that kind of stuff, Jesus would be unique in that he's one of like a huge group of mystery religion figures that that follow those same patterns, but Jesus would be the only one where it's actually based on a real person.
Right. And if you take, for example, the story of Simon Magus, who lived pretty much around the exact same time as Jesus, performing the same types of miracles that Jesus is said to have done. Like healing the sick, going out and, resurrecting people from the dead, a la Lazarus, all these other things, turning water into wine and shit. Pretty much every single quote-unquote miracle to which Jesus has been attributed as the originator have also been attributed to the Simon Magus character.
So who is this Simon Magus guy? And there is documentation of this?
Yeah, there's extra biblical evidence to support the existence of Simon Magus, whereas there's very little to support that of Jesus. But this Magus character was another contemporary itinerant Jewish rabbi going around preaching salvation and messianic ideas and supposedly performing miracles. And then there's this Jesus character, or Yeshua, or whatever the fuck you want to call him, who's also doing some of the same things.
Right.
There are a lot of people in the same general time period who are going around doing the same things that Jesus supposedly did. So, which of these characters is the Bible referring to? Or is it a combination of them? Or is the entire thing just a giant myth? Because like I said in the introduction, a lot of the like the general story itself, the dying and rising God, is not original to Christianity.
No, not at all. It's very borrowed. Like unless we go down to like the more minor miracles and stuff like that, then those can be attributed to Jesus and only Jesus. Not even, actually. We were talking about that in the car, right? Like the whole turning
water to wine and multiplying the...
Dionysus had done this or something?
Right. Dionysus,
Dionysus was the god of wine who
sorry.
the Romans later co-opted and turned into Bacchus.
Bacchus, yeah.
Like the god of wine. One of his main miracles was turning water into wine.
Yeah.
And the fact that Dionysus is also one of those first dying and rising gods, predating Jesus by around 1,500 years.
Yeah.
You can make the argument that the Jesus story was borrowed heavily from the Dionysus story and the Osiris story that came before him. But that's not to say that just because these stories have similarities means that therefore the Jesus story was necessarily copied from them. Although the tendency seems to be that...
Well, if you use Occam's razor, right? The simpler explanation is just that this is another one of those stories that follows the same pattern.
Yeah, like is it more likely that the God of the universe came down and incarnated as a human in the figure of Jesus, or is this simply another retelling of the same general story? Occam's razor would tend to suggest, retelling. Right? There are less steps you have to take
You would think.
to reach that conclusion, one would think. But even so, even if, like, to me, like I said, if there was no historical Jesus figure, that would be the death knell for Christianity, I would think. And yet, it persists.
Only in the sense that they're believing in it as a reality sort of thing, which not all Christians do. I mean, some Christians are able to go, you know what, it's meant to be a representation. And,
right, and that's...
we can say...
I don't know why my voice...
Your voice got what, sir?
Taco fell in the fire, I'll get it. As I was trying to say before my voice did that weird thing, that's kind of where I was getting at. Right? Even if the historicity of Jesus were disproven, I think a lot of Christians would still cling to the notion that this is in some way symbolic, or, it's really the essence of the faith that counts towards the religion. They would refuse to give up their belief, even though the figure that's central to their religion were to be proven to not have existed in the first place.
I think in the ancient times, the use and purpose of myth was very different. And what we now just more easily categorize as either fiction or fact.
Right.
Like, it wasn't really perceived that way back then.
Like in the sense that we are trying to be more black and white these days?
Yeah, exactly. But back then, it was much easier to just talk about to talk about myths in terms of truths, like something that is actually referring to something real, maybe not literally real, but real in terms of like the
effect that it will have,
the human experience or whatever, right?
So the Jordan Peterson approach to mythology,
I guess. Yeah, but I mean that's not something new to Jordan Peterson or
wait, I have to create a murmur in the background.
But like nowadays, it seems like people are way too religious people specifically are way too married to a literalist paradigm or worldview, and so they can't accept. They wouldn't know how to handle proving that. Let's say you could prove that Jesus, the real man, the literal man, never existed. They wouldn't be able to handle that being true, but also their religion being true and all of the mythos around it having some kind of truth to it. The fact that he wasn't literally true means that the mythos wasn't true. And this is the touchy part that I was saying about what you were introducing, where like if we prove or if we can sow doubt in terms of whether or not Jesus actually existed, then that disproves Christianity or the religion, that's problematic, I think, because...
Well, I didn't say it disproves it. I said it shakes its foundations.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Because like if this Jesus character didn't exist, then the entire purpose of him being here kind of flies out the window, right? If there was no figure to have come down and redeemed humanity from original sin, then the religion falls apart.
Not if you take the religion on a mythical basis. Because,
But
like, for example, there have been several Jesus mythicists, is I guess what they're called.
right.
And some of them, one of them, Tom Harper, was an actual Anglican priest, and he wrote in the late 90s, I think 99, maybe even early 2000s, a book called The Pagan Christ. And he goes through a lot of these, a lot of the parallels that the Jesus story has with previous gods like Osiris and Dionysus and all this kind of stuff. But he comes out of that not feeling like he's in some way disproving or doing violence to the Christian religion. He talks about how that actually kind of strengthened his faith, because he's seeing it as much more of a spiritual and internal and like kind of more broadly meaningful thing, rather than just being something about mundane facts.
It sounds like you're describing a somewhat intelligent Christian. Like someone that can do something intelligent with Christianity.
It does kind of sound like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I think in the minds of a lot of Christians, that it's all fine to say that Harper came to that intellectual conclusion, right? But to a lot of Christians, they take the story literally. There was literally a character known as Jesus Christ, who is the incarnated aspect of God, come to redeem them from Eve's original sin.
Yeah.
Well, it's because they just can't make that separation. They need something to be historically true in order for it to be meaningfully true.
Right.
And I'm using that word carefully.
Yeah. And what I'm saying is if it were possible to disprove the historicity of Jesus, then you're cutting their legs out from under them in that regard. Because they wouldn't have that literalist kind of thing to fall back on, because Jesus just simply didn't. There was no historical person
Like
to fit
you're
that description.
saying, you would upset the stupid Christians in that sense, kind of thing. It would cripple them. Their crutches would be knocked out, and they would be on the ground.
Right.
Kind of thing. Right.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that a lot of atheists, people who disbelieve in the Christian religion and everything around it, most of them are actually totally willing to admit that a historical Jesus probably existed.
Yeah, that was
because of the convention, right? The conventional historical assumption is that there was a real guy named Jesus, and he was the source of this religious mythology that evolved around that.
Yeah, that was something I was going to touch on. Is the mythicist position isn't widely accepted in Bible scholarship as being something worth considering, because the overwhelming consensus is that there was a historical figure that the Jesus idea is based around. Mm-hmm. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that the majority of biblical scholars are of a Christian persuasion, and denying the historicity of Jesus would kind of put their own faith in doubt. We don't really see a lot of biblical scholars who are not of a Christian persuasion to begin with.
Although you're seeing them more and more.
Today we are, and I think that might be an indication that the mythicist position would be something worth considering.
Yeah.
Right, because if they don't have that,
there was far too much sort of a systemic kind of momentum behind the truth of Christianity and stuff like that, at least in Western culture, that anytime a mythicist would pop up saying, "Hey, I'm reading this stuff and it kind of puts in doubt whether or not this shit is real or hoax or whether or not it's just a meaningful myth or or a literal truth. Those people were hand waved away as fringe idiots, and there are a lot of fringe idiots actually that glom on to the idea that Jesus was never a real person, therefore everything about Christianity is false, and including the myth. The myth is suddenly no longer meaningful if he's not literally true,
Right.
and that's a fallacy, right? I haven't like actually measured out or counted out like how many mythicists fall in that column versus the other more kind of reserving judgment column kind of thing, but the idea that there's more mythicists emerging now that are actually managing to get peer review and
Right.
And maintain sort of an academic credibility. I think that's telling.
Right. I think so too. Like we're seeing an emergence of seriously academic works on the part of mythicists today. That are kind of eschewing the whole idea that their ideas are kind of on the fringe of biblical research, right? And I think that's something important to consider. Like, do we really have evidence to suggest that Jesus was a historical figure? In the realm of historicity, is there reason to accept the claim or the presupposition that Jesus was, in fact, a person? Did he really live? In the same way that, we would assume any story about George Washington or Julius Caesar as being historically accurate without doubting the existence of either Washington or Caesar,
Well, it's like there's the story of Jesus casting demons into a couple thousand pigs, and then driving them into the sea.
Right.
Like basically, Jesus performs an exorcism, right?
Yeah.
And he gets those demons out, and he puts them into pigs and drives those into the sea. So this is one of Jesus's miracles. But if we read this story about Caesar,
right,
we would think we wouldn't doubt that Caesar existed, but we would think that this is an embellishment that was added on to. Whereas when it comes to Jesus, all of a sudden, this is used as evidence of Jesus' divinity,
right? Rather than casting doubt on the existence of.
So either Jesus was a real guy, and this is an exaggerated story that was added on to give him some kind of gravitas and divine credibility, or the whole thing is just fake. There was never a Jesus, and they just said, hey, someone performed this huge miracle, let's call him Jesus, and all this other stuff.
So let's ask the question, like, what is your position on the historicity of Jesus Christ? Luke, let's start with you.
Well, like I was mentioning at the beginning, I think that there seems to be evidence that there was a real person called Jesus, and that he was he did upset the Romans and was crucified. There's also a bit of evidence I was mentioning to Gilles in the car ride over that some Buddhist monks at the period in the Bible where Jesus disappeared from I don't know
when he died.
No. Before he basically went about preaching, that he studied with the Buddhists.
Yeah.
And there is some Buddhist texts that suggest there was a guy called Jesus who came and hung out with them and seemed to know a lot. He was pretty smart on the God stuff. So
pretty smart on the God stuff.
Yeah. And that is documented. It seems
you're pretty
that
good
there
at
was
this God stuff.
There was a character named Jesus that did come and he was smart at the God stuff.
Yeah.
So I would suggest that it seems to be, you were asking whether or not it's a mix of both, fact and fiction, and so yes, it seems to be that it's a mix of fact and fiction, and you were mentioning earlier, Gilles, that he's kind of the first character that there seems to be some evidence that he did exist.
No. He's the first He's the first character that, like, the first God character.
Yeah.
That follows those same patterns and is basically like a dime a dozen. But he would be unique in being the only one that was actually based on a real guy.
Right.
Whereas everyone else, they just granted that this is a god figure and might be mythical.
Maybe this explains his.
Like, people
his
don't generally
popularity
think
in a
Zeus
sense.
really existed.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, even back then, they didn't think of, like, Aphrodite as being a real person.
Right.
You know, or
I mean, the people that wrote about Jesus wrote about him hundreds of years later. Like, the Bible is written not by people that hung out with Jesus. This was hundreds of years later.
You get Jesus born around 1 or 0, and then he dies around 33. Then you gotta wait like 20 or 30 years for Paul's epistles, his letters talking about Jesus, and then you gotta wait another several decades for the Gospels to start happening.
Yeah, and it was only like 400 years later that the Bible started to emerge as an actual text.
If we're looking at memory in terms of reliability, it is not reliable at all. And this is something
so
that
the
can be
funny thing
proven
is
now,
is that the details get more and more fleshed out the more removed you get chronologically from the actual guy,
and that's
which makes no sense.
And that's why I was saying at the beginning, like, part of it is this post hoc attribution of old Jewish prophecy, right? The longer you go, the more you can just, like, retcon the idea of Jesus into being like, hey, this guy came and fulfilled all this shit. How do we know? Because we're telling you that he did these things. You know, like, they go in, they create the narrative to fit something that the original prophecy was supposed to foretell. And then they're like, hey, Jesus did this shit. He's the Messiah, so we should start a religion. You know, it just, like, my position is that there were all these different messianic figures around the same time that Jesus lived, right? So I think the figure in the Bible is an amalgam of all of them, you know, fleshed on to all these different mythologies.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So was there an actual singular figure known as Jesus? Probably not. But then again, I don't know.
And Jesus, like, conveniently is a super common name from the time. It's like
Yeshua.
Yeah.
Joshua is the modern version of it. You know, there were a lot of people who bore that name for some reason around that time. Right. You know, like, I don't know.
I wonder why. Because who were they naming it after? Why was it so popular?
No, before Jesus was a thing.
But
Jesus
that's what I mean.
Was the popular name.
But why was it a popular name, I wonder? There must have been an earlier Jesus.
Maybe. Where do names come from? Like in modern times, most of our Western Anglo names come from biblical.
It's true. Yeah.
Sources. Luke, you're one of the gospel writers.
I am.
What up? True. So am I.
Yeah. Jill,
Mark.
Jill, you're no one.
I'm no one. Although I think I looked, when I was a kid, I looked into, like, the etymological root of my name, and it comes from, like, a Roman source. Which is
okay. Oh, you're a Jesus killer, is what you're saying.
Jesus
no,
killer.
no. Didn't the Romans figure out a way to absolve themselves of Jesus' death with the whole Pilate story, where they basically shunt off all of the blame.
It was a democratic process.
They shunt off the blame to the Jewish Sanhedrin, right?
Yeah.
Because they have Pontius Pilate wash his hands of the thing.
He literally washed his hands of it.
Yeah, and then he leaves it up to the crowd to decide whether Barabbas or this other guy would be put to death, which is just absurd. Like, it's a.
See, the way I like to look at the Jesus story is the same way I like to look at the King Arthur story. You know, there's equal, there's equal evidence for the historicity of both of these characters.
Yeah.
You know, like you have various Roman accounts of a warlord named Arturus, you know, who fits the King Arthur legend, and all of these different things were later attributed to King Arthur. All these victories and all the way that he was able to push back the Saxons from invading Britain and all this other stuff. Hundreds of years after the fact. And yet we can't pinpoint a singular figure by the name of Arturus or Arthur who would fit the bill.
Yeah.
In the same way that all of these different miracles and all these different stories are attributed to someone named Jesus, who lived around a certain period of time, and yet we can't necessarily identify a single figure by that name and that description. You know? So King Arthur is the same kind of legend as the Jesus thing.
Yeah.
But for some reason, the Arthurian legends are seen more as being mythos than the Jesus ones. I don't know if that's just because King Arthur wasn't a messiah and wasn't a god figure to a certain extent.
Well, I think the only reason is the vulnerability of the people that can't possibly process the idea that he wasn't real, right?
Right.
Which is something you brought up earlier. Like, there's people holding on to this Jesus shit like it's life or death. Like, if Jesus ain't real, I'm killing people. Oh, suddenly I have to rape people because there's no reason not to, you know? Like, it's...
Holy cow, isn't that contemptible? Like,
the only reason why you're not
the only thing holding
because...
me back from murdering all of you and being a malicious, like, piece of garbage and being absolutely worthless to the human experience of everybody else around you.
It's because someone says...
Is because some authority in the sky is watching me and holding me back.
At the same time, though...
That's contemptible.
Yeah.
At the same time, I can also...
People talk about being religious as being a virtue? Fuck you! That's horrendous to me.
Yeah, like if that's the only thing holding you back, you're a terrible person.
So we just like to send a big fuck you to all the religious people out there.
No, but really,
well, I mean, most of these people, they don't think about it in those terms or about that. I guess the logic I'm employing there. So to some extent they're innocent or naive in that sense. But when I examine it, like, to me it's contemptible if
well, you know,
like even though you don't intend to be malicious, by saying that the only thing keeping you from killing is some paternalistic divine figure that's more powerful than you, like. That's really lame in terms of being a statement of your virtue.
It's funny to think
if you're virtuous, that should be coming from inside you. You should be inherently good.
Right, exactly.
But they may also just not be recognizing that it is already there. They're attributing it to.
That's it.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Like if you're to pull that carpet out from underneath them, they still exist. Like it's not as if
exactly.
suddenly they're bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a funny thing.
It's a refusal to look deeper into their religion and their belief system, right?
Or the implications of the logic of it.
Right, like they just don't dig beyond the surface of, well, you know, you have to accept Jesus into your heart if you want to go to heaven, and that's it. They don't consider the consequences of what that belief entails. They don't dig deeper than the superficial idea that, you know, okay, so Jesus.
The other problem there is that they're not actually doing it. They're not actually Christian.
Well,
they're just calling themselves Christian.
That's a no true Scotsman fallacy. You know? Like if someone proclaims themselves as Christian, I'll believe them. Right?
No, but what I mean is that they're not actually following. They're not. They're only believing. They're not.
That's a tough argumentative tack to pull off, I think, because it goes two ways, right? You hear a lot of people saying, well, like Jordan Peterson, for example,
right, yeah.
that there are no atheists.
Hold on.
Everyone, right. Yeah, he says that there are no atheists. Everybody works on the assumption first that there's a God, and then they're arguing against that.
Jordan Peterson, right? Presuppositionalist.
Yeah. That's it. It's purely the presuppositionalist.
It's funny how I don't know much about this Jordan Peterson guy, but whenever I hear of him, like anything that I've ever seen, grumble. Like I just don't want to see more.
And it's funny because we did a whole episode
made him the figurehead for a lot of the issues that
figurehead
that we used to talk about without Jordan Peterson.
Well, like Peterson takes the Christ mythos as purely mythological, like because of his way of proclaiming myth as some form of truth, and that goes back to the whole debate he had with Sam Harris, like arguing about what is true. To Peterson, myths are a form of truth. So therefore...
Yeah, but not just to Peterson. That's actually a point I agree with him on.
Well, to an extent, sure. But like the Peterson aspect of it is, I am a Christian because I believe the myth behind Christianity, the driving mythology of Christianity, to have a certain element of truth, therefore I am Christian.
Well, it wouldn't have stuck around if there wasn't some sort of substance to it, in a sense. I
Yeah,
mean,
but the
there's
substance
a point
doesn't...
of interest
But
there.
literal truth isn't substance. Literal truth is mundane. The
Literal truth is mundane.
Yes.
What do you mean, objective truth?
Mythical truth is the truth that actually starts to explore meaning behind narratives and stuff, and then you can analogously or
so we can call them
like
existential
a parable
truths.
or whatever. You by analogy you can put that on your own.
It's the truth.
Life experience.
It's the truth the myth is meant to convey. Right?
Yeah.
In a sense, almost artistically. Like, as in... Because I recently, on the religious channel, saw someone explaining religion as art. And, in the sense that... And they were even saying most Christians aren't truly Christian. They don't actually follow their own rules, kind of thing. They're poor Christians, kind of thing. And I just thought it was interesting to see someone admitting, like, it's meant to be like an art form that doesn't translate to... there's as many different ways of practicing a religion, including Christianity or Islam or Buddhism, as there are people, pretty much, right? Like everybody kind of does a little bit of buffet picking and choosing in terms of what they're going to adhere to, pun intended, religiously, versus what they're willing to just kind of let slide as not inherently necessary to their religion, right? Like, yeah. One of my favorite things recently, watching the religious channel, because every once in a while...
What is the religious channel?
Well, because I don't have internet access, so I'm not streaming anything. So I really do have some old aerials plugged into the back of the TV, and I'm watching the channels that I can get. And so one of them is the religious channel.
Okay.
It's like 42. I think it's 42.
Okay. And they just like broadcast like televangelists and
Highway to Heaven.
Masses.
Michael Landon.
Oh yeah,
one of our favorite shows lately. Yeah,
wow,
it's great.
That's a good show though.
But recently, one of my favorite things that happened though is every once in a while I'll put on music and have just the TV on in the background. And so what was happening was it was a call-in religious show.
Yeah.
And it was two guys answering calls.
Sort of like the atheist experience, but for religious people?
And so at the bottom of the screen it says, "Does God answer your prayers?" And the music was on. And so I wasn't hearing the person on the telephone. So it really was just two people staring at the camera for like 5 minutes, not saying anything.
Oh my God.
So that was the show.
Trippy.
Does God answer your prayers? And it was just them staring. Which I thought was hilarious.
It's kind of funny because then you think like, you could almost see it as like being like a couple of atheists or something, like being like, let that sink in for a moment.
Yeah.
Think about it for a second.
About it.
Actually think about it. We're not going to say anything for a while. I just want you to think.
It was good. Made me laugh.
Yeah. Made you laugh. Mark, thanks for coming back from the toilet.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Holding that in for half an hour.
I have to pee as well.
Remiss. Something about answering prayers?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was watching the religious channel, and
okay.
and they had he saw like a call-in show, kind of like the Atheist Experience, and there were two guys like behind a table answering calls from people, and the question on the chyron at the bottom was like, "Does God answer prayers?" But he couldn't hear the caller, so all he sees when he looks at the TV is two people staring at the camera,
directly at the camera,
while you anything. Let that question sink in.
We watched it for like 5 minutes, laughing our asses off. Like that was the best show on TV at that time. Does God answer your prayers? Nothing.
Does God answer prayers? Oh,
crickets.
That could be an entire episode. But like how effective is prayer? And I think we've answered the question before, right? There have been studies done on this. Yeah, and there's a negative correlation to
you can test it empirically.
Well, what does prayer mean? Like, for example, this
intercessory prayer versus...
Let's pretend that Jesus was a real person, and when he, went off to pray, what was that compared to what people are doing?
Right.
Because I don't think it's the same thing. Like, it may be that he was meditating in a sense, right? Like in the way that Buddhists are meditating and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like a blanking of the mind, and then that's speaking to
Yeah,
God.
it has an
That makes a lot
effect
more
on your
sense.
psyche.
It has
to be doing
it
this.
calms you. It does all these good things. I don't know what people that pray
Some people
mean
think
by pray.
it's basically like testing an all-powerful thing, and like playing the lottery. You're hoping, okay, maybe he'll get this message, and I'll actually
Like you're sending.
your
God text.
Santa Claus will
God
actually
texting.
bring me this present that I'm.
You're making a wish, essentially.
Yeah,
That's what you're
wishing.
doing.
Like
You're wishing.
Praying is not wishing, from what I can.
But that's
understand
how
of praying.
most people take prayer or use it. It's asking for something.
Are we saying
Like,
this
Jesus,
is
please find my car keys or whatever.
right? Yeah, like that is what prayer has become.
That's what it's become. Yeah.
Right.
And it's,
It's
a,
like the
it's a
consumerist
testable
version of-
hypothesis. You can test for this shit.
Right.
And it doesn't work.
Yeah, if
There's-
if we get like so many people to pray for the reversal of this state of affairs, then,
Right, climate change. Let's all get together and
Well,
fuck
the
yeah,
climate
like,
will be better if we just pray.
why is no one praying to alter climate change? And why is God not answering those prayers? Like you can. It's really easy to test this hypothesis. Pray for X, see if X happens. If it doesn't, prayer doesn't work. Intercessory prayer has been tested numerous times.
Or special pleading.
Yeah.
It's because God works in mysterious ways. You won't understand the answer even if it does.
That is such a cop-out. I can't stand that. But yeah, like...
What's the point if you can't understand the answer? Even if
Well,
it
right. I've never really understood the difference between there being a God and not being a God is my issue. Like, I don't see why things would be different.
That's fundamentally...
Yeah, like a question I like to talk to, but this is going into a different direction, but when it comes to like creationism versus evolution, I like to ask people, okay, if you believe in creationism, in order to falsify that, what do you think a universe that was not intelligently designed would look like?
Right.
And they can't answer that because how could they? The only universe we have to compare is the one we find ourselves in, and that's the only universe we can make any kind of measurement on. The only thing we can derive any kind of information from. We have nothing to compare it to. We have no other universe to say, well, this is a non-designed one.
It would
this
be
is
great to
designed.
have another world alongside our world to experiment with,
Sure.
and see how things go differently.
That's a problem. We don't even have a closest planet to study except for like Mars and stuff, and we haven't even been there.
Yeah.
The only thing we have to rely on is data sent back by robots, right? We can make inferences based on that, but we don't have another universe to compare ours to. We don't like. So for people to say that this is obviously a designed universe and there's obviously a God who put it together, how can you say that's obvious? You don't have anything with which to compare it. You have no basis for making that kind of conclusion, And it's so frustrating to listen to people like, if just look at the trees and look at this and look at that and it's obviously designed. How can you reach that conclusion? I think I spent your bathroom break on a rant about design here, so...
Yeah, it
I
went
had to
something
see what
like
all
this.
the fuss was about.
Jill, it went something like
I'm telling
this.
you, that toilet is definitely living up to its reputation.
So we've kind of deviated away from the Jesus thing, going into other stuff, but still very relevant.
You ended up on
really,
intelligent design.
I did.
Coming back to the Jesus thing, there really isn't. I mean, honestly, how could I even prove that I existed yesterday?
So if do you
let
wanna
alone
apply,
go back 2,000 years
Yeah,
and
and
try to
that's
prove the existence of a guy. Like,
you want to apply solipsism to
So-
Jesus?
No, but I get
it.
that argument, and there's some validity to it, right? But then, what that proves isn't that Jesus existed. It just proves
that it's unprovable.
that right, or
It's
I don't know if it's kind of as a proof.
It's not proof that he didn't exist, but it's not proof that he existed either. That you can't find.
It's just another example of hard solipsism.
There you go.
In a way, but yeah, that's my main problem. There's no extra biblical evidence to support a historical Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, you get extra biblical sources like Josephus, where you have these references to Christ. But I think it's in Josephus where there's like this. It's basically a paragraph in his like big history, and it refers to Jesus being being killed on the cross or whatever. And
it refers to somebody.
Christians. But even biblical scholars who are believers, most of them admit or are willing to accept that could be an interpolation because it doesn't match the language preceding or following
right.
it and doesn't really make sense in the thread.
Yeah, it doesn't fit the overarching narrative or whatever.
Yeah. And a lot of these other extra biblical sources, they're mostly referring to either Christ being... They're either referring to Christians, who are definitely some sect going around, just like 100 other religious cults or mini religions, right? So you can talk about the Christians without necessarily, and you can talk about the Christ of those followers of those religious followers without necessarily meaning to say that you're talking about a real person.
Yeah,
I can talk about people who are into like the Norse pantheon, like who believe in Odin and all of this kind of shit, but that doesn't mean just because I mention Odin that I'm saying that Odin was a real dude.
Right, exactly. Like they can talk about what these people believe without pinning it on one particular individual.
And most of the extra biblical sources are doing that kind of thing. It's not...
And there's no... Like, they may be doing that. They may be talking about the sect that believes a certain way.
Yeah.
But that doesn't prove that a character fitting that narrative actually existed.
Yeah.
I think that the three of us can agree, though, that it doesn't remove what could be deemed the importance of the message, and in a sense the reason why the idea of this Jesus character has stuck around for so long.
The message, maybe. Like, you can still say that despite the non-existence or the potential non-existence of a historical figure by the name of Jesus, the message would still carry some kind of weight. But...
Well, and it has to have carried some sort of weight, otherwise it wouldn't have stuck around.
There's a bunch of different messages.
And there's there's like hundreds of people that are shoehorning or basically tacking their message onto this thing that's gaining momentum. This cultural thing.
And it also doesn't say anything to prove whether or not the supernatural elements were in any way true. Like, even if a character that fits the description did exist, doesn't make him divine. All it says is somebody existed.
Yeah.
The most frustrating to me is when they use the Bible itself as a historical source.
Yeah.
For trying to prove the existence.
Like using the Bible to prove the Bible?
Yeah, that kind of circular thing. And the funny thing is, the Gospels, they just don't look like a historical record.
Well, no, they were writing theology. They weren't writing history.
It's a narrative with like way too much detail, and when you look at a historical record, normally it's like, okay, such and such a name, born at this time and dying at this time, and such and such events being attributed or connected to this person.
Yeah,
that's it. But where with Jesus, you get this narrative. So the ironic thing is when you're looking at historical documents that are talking about characters and figures and stuff like that, ironically, a clue to whether something is a fictional figure versus or whether something is a fictional document versus a historical one is that the fictional one will have a lot more detail.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there's a lot of detail about Jesus in the Gospels is actually a clue to it being false or to it being fictional.
Well, they were writing theology. They were not writing history when they put these texts together. And the fact that none of the books in the Bible were signed, we have no idea who wrote them. We don't know at what period these things were written.
Yeah, there seems to be evidence that suggests it was split up afterwards and attributed to different names afterwards, and it was more so this Mark character that wrote a lot of them, and then it split off into different people's names and
yeah, and you can go even deeper where Mark and the three other gospel writers are actually pulling from another source. This Q source is what they call it, and they're all kind of riffing off of that other source that we don't have any evidence of, other than the kind of textual analysis kind of evidence of saying these guys are wrong. What's that?
I was going to say, I like this idea of riffing. Like you're given the scale and just go. Do your solo, you know.
That's it. They're riffing off of it. Yeah.
So here's the idea. Make up a story around it, you know. Yeah. And that's pretty much what ended up happening. And these are just the four Gospels that wound up in the Bible. That's not to say anything about the ones that didn't make it.
Yeah.
You know, the ones that didn't support the idea of Jesus' divinity did not make the final cut in the Bible.
Well, is there not some sort of idea these days that the Mary Magdalene bit of the Bible was cut from the Bible, but that she was perhaps the closest to Jesus, and she was the one that was meant to carry on
there's like more ancient religious figures that they think are like kind of proto Mary Magdalene, like Asherah, I think is one that you'll hear about, and it seems like there's evidence that there was a religion based around this woman divine figure as
divine
like
feminine.
the central character, and yet you get them kind of borrowing from that and sort of co-opting it for more traditionally paternalistic.
Right. The white bald men got a hold of that. And we're like, no, can't possibly be a black woman that did this. No.
Yeah.
Let's make it a white guy.
Yeah.
Long hair.
Yeah.
Let's just make it a white guy. I think there's some. I don't know what to say about that. Like I don't know. I know there's like some sect that wants to attribute like a greater importance to the Mary Magdalene figure than what we have today. Like there's some forgotten Gospels and stuff that didn't make the final cut of the Bible. There's Magdalene apparently had her own Gospel.
Yeah.
With it.
And it does exist? Did it survive? Like, does it still exist?
It was found as part of either the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi Library. One of those two.
What is this last one? The what?
The Nag Hammadi Library was another like cache of scrolls or fragments of scrolls in the cave.
When was this discovered?
Isn't like the...
Like
80s,
recently?
Maybe?
Yeah, fairly recently. Like in the 20th century.
Holy cow.
Yeah. Cave somewhere, jars, scrolls, put them together. Hey, look, a bunch of stuff that looks kind of biblical. Written around the same time, some stories that contradicted some of the other stories that made it in. Like, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't fit the narrative that they left out because they wanted a more or less cohesive idea that Jesus was the Son of God, and anything that didn't support that idea was left aside. And today we have what we have. We have quite possibly what might just be a myth or an amalgamation of myth/history. So final thoughts on the issue of whether or not Jesus was a historical figure.
I'm gonna settle into it can't be true.
Well, what do you mean by it? Do you mean it depends on what the definition of is?
What do you mean by settle true? With is.
What do you mean by true?
Yeah, so are you referring to the whole divine mythos, or specifically about whether or not there was a physical, literal man named Jesus?
No, I do think it's possible there was a guy named Jesus that possibly upset the Romans and was killed. But I mean, it turns out it was just a really popular name anyway. So of course, like, what are the chances of there not being a Jesus?
Exactly. Yeah.
That upset the Romans.
Yeah.
The Romans were upset.
It's like when they.
Well, it wasn't so much that he upset the Romans as it was he upset the Jews. Like, he pissed off the Jewish rabbinical councils and stuff because he claimed to be the Messiah that was prophesied in the Old Testament. And
so a lot of these mystery religions, though, like we were talking about, like some of the similarities. There's a few fundamental things that they all do together that make them kind of robust or kind of something to be reckoned with, and one of them is the opening up the religion to anybody, right? Rather than being something that you're born into and is passed down.
Which is funny.
So like the Jewish religion, if your mom's a Jew, then you're a Jew automatically.
Yeah.
Whereas this whole concept of joining a religion, that's when this pops up, when these kinds of mystery religions and stuff happen. Christianity being one of them. So Christianity, to a large extent, is Judaism plus Judaism plus.
Yeah, Judaism plus.
With the ability for anybody who doesn't have a Jewish mother,
which would explain its popularity. It's all encompassing.
Exactly.
It's going. You come on in.
It's
doors are open.
You're adding a software patch to it to make it to make it even more
USB
viral,
ports.
Populist Judaism.
Yeah,
is I think what it was. Sure. Yeah.
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 Yep.
Final thoughts. What are your thoughts there, Sheldon?
My final thoughts are that I think I'm totally on the mythicist side.
Like, what percentage would you give yourself towards that then? Like 0 being literal historical figure, 100 being like total like mythical figure.
Since I'm completely uneducated, well, not completely uneducated, but since I'm nowhere near an expert in like biblical history and all this kind of stuff, I won't say I'm like 100% or whatever. Maybe I'll say like a nice confident 75%.
Okay.
I was gonna say 80.
Okay, sure.
I've chosen for you. You feel more comfortable with that number.
Yeah.
No, I feel like it is quite possible that there was a Jesus figure that was a bit of an anarchist and upset some people, basically. And then they had something to stick this legend to, and attribute things to. But I mean, who knows what this guy did?
Well, yeah,
he was probably...
It bugs me that the biggest or the most common kind of rebuttal to the idea that Jesus might have never existed and might actually be like the God figures of the dime a dozen other religions that are just like it. The most common rebuttal is that it's just incredulity. I can't believe that this central figure that has influenced all of Western society for the history since couldn't have been a real guy. But that's just a fallacious argument on its face. So
yeah, like the number of people who
believe
something
it bugs me. So that's why I'm not sympathetic at all to it, and why I want to land firmly in the middle of the other side of the equation.
Yeah, like the number of people who believe a claim says nothing to whether or not that claim is true.
Yeah.
Right, of course.
Like that's just like, well, it has to be true because look at how many people believe the idea.
But
like, no.
The other point to be made is that it just doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Like, if we're able to do something good with the idea of Jesus, then let's do something good. It doesn't matter if it was real or false. Like, who cares?
Yeah. I care.
It's more so about doing something good.
Well, it's like last week we talked about Mormonism, right? And there's a lot of parallels, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Between Mormonism and this, we didn't really get into it.
Yeah,
but
there's just there's a longer time frame between Christianity and Mormonism.
Yeah, and the fact that Mormonism has grown into a real religion and takes a big chunk of the U.S. population in terms of religious adherence, it doesn't mean that those golden tablets were ever real.
Right.
Yeah.
Like Jesus just spoke to me in poops. Like in the toilet, I looked in and there was a sign.
There you go. Yeah.
And let's just spread the word.
Yeah.
Spread the shit.
Spread the shit.
Yeah. We should call ourselves the Coprolites. Doesn't that
Coprolites?
Yeah. That's like
I don't know what it means, but it's good.
The Stoolicists.
The Stoolicists. Yeah, but even the golden tablets actually kind of follow a similar kind of story. Like they come to Earth from heaven, and then they are reascended back to heaven
physically.
And when people in the story of people getting proof of their existence it's those tablets reappearing in some kind of divine vision type form, right? Remember we were talking about the three witnesses?
Yeah.
So it's just like when Jesus reappears. Is it Simon?
Yeah.
Who, like, he's like floating above them all or whatever. And
Poking
Simon
his
comes
holes.
over and pokes his holes.
Pokes his holes.
Or whatever. But we don't actually get to keep a body of Jesus to say, like...
Yeah, no, because he vanished up to heaven.
Yeah, because he
physical
vanished
form.
Conveniently, just like the books did, just like the golden tablets or whatever.
Hey, do you mind if we parade you around town, making everyone believe that you came back to life? Sorry, guys, I have a dinner thing with Dad.
Yeah.
But go ahead and poke my holes while I'm here.
You got like 2 minutes to poke.
You
the
got
holes.
2 seconds to poke the holes. That's all I can give you, man. Sorry.
I gotta go.
With your finger! With your finger! God damn it, Simon!
I got a thing.
We got a thing. I gotta get back to Kolob and throwback to our previous episode about Mormonism.
Yeah.
As for myself, I think I lean more towards the mythicist position, although I'm also not a biblical scholar, so I can't say like one way or the other which has more validity. Like the fact that
we should always start our show with going. Let's just start with we're very ignorant.
Yeah.
We're just talking here.
Well, I think it's sous-entendu that we're kind of ignorant about a lot of things.
Oh, it's more than sous-entendu.
It's just entendu.
Usually entendu, yeah.
Our ignorance is showing. But I think that there is not enough evidence to support the existence of a singular historical figure that fits the bill.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the story was borrowed from and built onto previous mythologies like the Egyptian Osiris myth, the Greek Dionysus/Roman Bacchus myth.
Yeah.
The
story
Mithra.
already existed.
Mithra, right? Prime example.
Zoroastrianism actually, a lot
Which is,
of
by the way, just a fun word to say.
I know, right?
Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, that's the Persian
Right.
stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels in Zoroastrianism that predate Christianity, but that become central kind of premises in the Christian mythos.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Like, ultimately, does it matter? I think it does. I think whether or not it's true is an important question to ask. Because, to me anyway, because I always harp back on the fact that I want to have as many true beliefs as possible and as few false beliefs as I can hold. Right? Just because I would rather live in a world where my internal reality is as close to objective reality as I can get. And if this Jesus character happens to be not a historical figure, I'd like to know that, just out of pure academic kind of interest. It'd be cool to know.
Yeah.
But I don't.
I guess I just don't care if it's true or not. It just doesn't matter to me. The parables are there, the stories are there. I mean, the Bible is, if you read it, it's a good book.
No, it isn't.
Well, sure it is.
No, it isn't.
There's some good bits in there.
What? Well, all the genocide and the mass murder and the
I'm saying
the
as a
slavery
book, yeah,
thing.
Sure.
It's a terrible read.
I don't mean a good book in that sense.
No,
I mean
genocide
an interesting read.
being in a fictional narrative doesn't automatically make it a bad one.
Even
I mean,
if
you got genocide in like Game of Thrones and shit. That's a good read.
Even if you want to say it's a good read, no, it isn't.
Yeah, actually, literarily, is that a word? Literarily?
Literarily, like, from a literary point of view, it's it's terribly written.
It's not half as terribly written as the Mormon Bible. Oh my God,
Oh,
the
yeah,
Book of
yeah.
Mormon is just god awful. It is not entertaining at all. Whereas the Bible, you can find. I mean, there's certain books of the Bible are good.
That's
we can
right.
say.
Yeah, there's
and
certain
some aren't,
chapters
sure.
and
some are just
stuff
begot
that are
this and
readable.
begot that and begot that.
That's
so
it.
it's just
Okay,
really.
all right.
You might
There's
as well
a
be
lot
reading
of
Lord of the
filler
Rings.
in between the good bits.
So, all right, I'll admit, Book of Revelation might be kind of cool as a read. That's just full of really cool shit.
Oh, that's part of the stuff that there's a lot of commonality between Revelation and Zoroastrianism.
Oh, yeah.
It's the idea of like a war between good and evil.
See that last book? Cool last chapter, man. That was a good way to end the book.
Yeah.
Final battle, yo.
The boss.
Last boss fight. Who will win? Anyway, I don't know what we're doing for our next episode. I don't think we teased anything in this one, but maybe morality, we'll see. Could be a good one. I've been sitting on that one for like 2 years now, so should probably do it at some point. For now, though, this has been Critical Junction, episode 52. I'm Mark.
I'm Jesus.
I'm not Jesus.
As always, thanks for listening. And until next time, keep thinking critically.